Crimson Tales awaits secrets, suspense, and stories that will haunt your mind.
The air in Privet Drive seemed thinner that morning, as if the house itself had sensed tension and held its breath. Harry was in the kitchen, small and quiet as always, observing the minutiae of breakfast. The subtle bend of the butter knife as Vernon placed it on the table, the hum of the kettle rising in spirals, the faint vibration of magic in the walls. Stable but watchful, he didn't flinch when Vernon's shadow darkened the doorway, didn't even raise his gaze because he already knew what was coming. Vernon's temper had been building for days, though the usual triggers, Dudley's careless movements, Petunia's clipped tone, even a misaligned newspaper were insignificant. Today, however, the small annoyance of Harry's quiet defiance had been enough. His presence, calm, calculating, had begun to unsettle Vernon in ways he could not articulate. He did not understand why a boy who slouched, who flinched at raised voices, could command such invisible authority. "You think you can just sit there and ignore me, boy?" Vernon barked, a hand twitching toward Harry's shoulder. The movement was lightning fast to anyone else, but Harry had anticipated it. The moment Vernon's fingers flexed, the boy's body reacted, not magically, not visibly, but with the kind of precision that comes from years of silent observation and perfect timing. Vernon froze, mid-gesture, as if his arm had been caught in thick syrup. Harry's voice was calm, almost casual, as he spoke. "Touch me again and you will disappear." The words were not a threat in the emotional sense. There was no quiver of anger, no tremor of fear, but a precise statement of intent. Vernon felt it in a way he had never felt anything. The house seemed to grow heavier around him, the air solidifying. He could not move his arm. He could not breathe freely. Panic flared inside him, not just because of the boy's words, but because he sensed without understanding that Harry had the capacity to act and would act without hesitation. Petunia gasped softly from the doorway. Clutching a basket of laundry, she looked between her husband and her nephew, eyes wide with instinctive fear. Dudley, crouched awkwardly at the table, froze mid-bite. Every movement in the room had been arrested by a force that no one could see, no one could name, yet everyone felt. Harry's eyes, small but unflinching, met Vernon's. There was no hatred there, no childish tantrum. There was calculation, precision, and an undeniable calm. Every heartbeat, every intake of air, every flicker of thought had been measured. "That only works once," he repeated, softer this time, almost conversationally, but with the same weight of inevitability. Vernon's mind raced. He tried to pull his arm back, tried to step away, tried to claim some shred of normal authority, but every motion faltered. He felt the invisible barrier, the boundary Harry had drawn, and for the first time, he knew what it meant to face something that could not be bargained with, persuaded or intimidated. He had always believed that fear could be leveraged, that threats could bend will, but not today, not against Harry. For a moment, the room was silent, suspended in a fragile equilibrium. Petunia's basket nearly slipped from her hands as she exhaled a soundless shudder. Dudley blinked, the full comprehension of his cousin's power beginning to seep in, though he would never articulate it. The house itself seemed to acknowledge the shift. The wards, stable and invisible, hummed faintly, resonating in quiet approval at the boy's decisive assertion of control. Voldemort, observing from the tether embedded in Harry's scar, felt the first true resistance since their connection had been established. A pulse of intent met him, steady, cold, and immovable. Harry's mind did not quake under the weight of expectation. He did not plead, negotiate, or hesitate. He simply stood, silently in the full measure of his authority. And for the first time, Voldemort understood that the boy would never be subjugated by fear or coercion again. "Interesting," Voldemort murmured, his voice a ribbon of thought in Harry's mind. He could sense the steel behind the boy's calm, the discipline, the precision. The mark pulsed faintly. For the first time, it was met with a countercurrent. Harry had established a boundary the Dark Lord could not cross, not because of magical strength alone, but because of absolute control over intention, awareness, and restraint. Vernon slumped slightly. The fight drained from him. He did not speak, could not meet Harry's gaze, and yet understood perfectly that his usual tactics, yelling, intimidation, physical force, were now powerless. Petunia, still clutching her basket, mirrored his frozen state, her instinctive compliance driven by fear she could not name. Dudley, too large, too unaware, froze into the subtle obedience that had become habitual in the house whenever Harry chose to act. Harry, meanwhile, stepped back, allowing the suspended tension to dissolve. Though the lesson had been etched indelibly, the household had shifted, silently and permanently, into a new order. No one would ever Isanana Rills is autonomy again. The invisible line had been drawn, and it was unbreakable. Later, when the sun had begun its descent behind the hedges of Privet Drive, Harry touched the scar on his forehead. It no longer burned with fear or anticipation. It hummed faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of the boundary he had established. The connection to Voldemort remained, but the dynamic had changed forever. Harry had not only survived, he had imposed rules that even the most cunning would respect. And in the quiet of the house, with the Dursleys subdued and trembling in a new, inexplicable fear, Harry allowed himself a single, private smile. This was no longer a game of endurance, no longer a performance of fragility. The line had been drawn. Voldemort, watching invisibly, could do nothing but admire the precision and the finality. He would test Harry again, certainly, in ways subtle and direct, but he had learned something he could not unlearn. The boy's will was sovereign, absolute and unyielding. The rule was simple, elegant, and eternal. Harry Potter had the right to draw the line, and no one would cross it again. The house hummed in quiet accord. The wards, the mark, the boy's own awareness. They aligned in a perfect lattice of discipline and restraint. Privet Drive had never been so orderly, so taut with unspoken authority, so profoundly under the control of one small, silent observer who was no longer a victim. The lesson was clear. The line had been drawn, and no one, not Vernon, not Petunia, not Dudley, not Voldemort, would ever doubt it again. The morning air carried a brittle tension, as if even the light that filtered through the Privet Drive windows hesitated before settling. Harry sat on the edge of his bed, small hands clasped loosely, eyes scanning the familiar patterns of the room. The walls, the floorboards, the subtle vibrations of the wards embedded in every corner. Today was ordinary on the surface, but beneath that calm, every inch of the house bristled with awareness. Harry felt it before it arrived. He sensed the currents in the air shift, subtle changes in pressure, a pulse in the magical weave of the home. The letter would come, but it would not arrive easily. The morning progressed with the usual monotony. Vernon fussed over breakfast with the same blind irritability. Petunia carried out her chores with careful efficiency, and Dudley stomped about, oblivious to the silent order that now governed every movement in the house. Harry observed all of it, recording, measuring, testing his growing influence over the currents of attention and presence. Every glance, every sigh, every shuffle of feet was a variable in the equation of control he was constantly refining. Then came the sound of parchment brushing against the threshold, a soft, almost hesitant rustle that was out of place among the usual domestic clatter. Harry's eyes flicked toward the letter, which had appeared at the edge of the hall, hovering slightly above the floor. It trembled, as if aware that this was no ordinary home, no ordinary boy, and certainly no ordinary boundary of power. Harry moved his gaze deliberately toward it, and the letter reacted almost instinctively. It burned faintly at the edges, small curls of smoke curling upward, as if the wards, the house, and the boy himself had decided that intrusion must meet resistance. It was not destruction. It was a warning, a test, a measure of intention. Harry leaned forward slightly, his attention flowing outward in a careful stream of awareness. The letter shivered, tilted, hovered, then dropped softly to the floor, almost apologetically. He picked it up and weighed it in his hands. The parchment felt ordinary, yet it hummed faintly with a resistance that was entirely unfamiliar. The Hogwarts seal glimmered faintly, imbued with protective magic that had reacted to the boy's own power, acknowledging its presence, hesitating at its boundaries. In a distant office, far removed from the quiet tension of Privet Drive, Albus Dumbledore leaned over his desk, eyes narrowing behind half-moon spectacles. He had cast the usual spells of preparation, the meticulous enchantments that ensured every letter would arrive in safety, every seal would remain intact, every young witch and wizard would be observed. But something was wrong. The magical pathways that usually carried the letters smoothly had stalled. Hogwarts itself was resisting. The parchment hesitated halfway between the school and the cupboard under the stairs. Dumbledore observed the disturbance, the subtle quiver in the magical currents, and felt the first tremor of unease. He sensed discipline, auris, control, but not trauma. The boy was not afraid, not desperate, not compliant. The wards at Privet Trade, perfectly intact, were holding something more than protection. They were holding autonomy, and Hogwarts, attentive as ever, registered it instantly. Harry touched the seal lightly. The letter pulsed faintly beneath his fingers, warmth mingling with a subtle resistance. He read the words, the elegant script, and felt the faint tug of expectation embedded within. The school knew him, had observed his magical signature, and had intended for him to arrive at the appropriate time, in the appropriate frame of mind. Yet it hesitated. The protective lattice of the house, the carefully woven influence of his presence, the quiet discipline embedded by years of invisible tutelage, all demanded respect. The letter had to pause. The magic of Hogwarts, vast and ancient, deferred to the boy's unspoken authority. Dumbledore exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. Fawkes stirred, feathers rustling, sensing the subtle shift in energy that rippled across the miles. Hogwarts itself had hesitated, paused, and waited, not out of fear, not out of defiance, but in recognition of a force it had never measured before. Harry Potter's quiet, precise, absolute control over his own power and environment. In Privet Drive, Harry examined the letter carefully, the edges of the parchment curling faintly from the friction of wards it could not penetrate fully. He could feel the subtle pulse of Hogwarts enchantments, the school's attempt to communicate authority, to guide, to shepherd, but met with the firm boundary he had silently established. He smiled faintly, a private acknowledgement of the balance he had achieved. The world had tried to act on him, but he would decide when, how, and if. The letter had come late. It had been slowed, tempered, restrained. It had hesitated, but it had arrived. That was all that mattered. Harry's hand tightened briefly around it, not in fear, not in excitement, but in quiet acknowledgement of the hierarchy now firmly in place. Hogwarts would act, but it would act on his terms. The wards had enforced respect. The boy had enforced boundaries. And somewhere, unseen, Voldemort felt the faint vibration through the tether of the mark. The boy had expanded control subtly, elegantly, imperceptibly. There was no outcry, no dramatic confrontation, only the gentle, unyielding assertion of authority that reminded the Dark Lord of one immutable truth. Harry Potter would always act deliberately, always on his own terms. The Dursleys continued their routines, oblivious to the invisible currents of magic and control that had shifted subtly around them. The letter lay on the floor of the cupboard, a promise and a test, waiting for Harry to decide when the school would have its say. Harry closed his eyes briefly, placing a hand on his scar. The tether pulsed faintly, a rhythm that spoke of instruction, guidance, and an awareness he no longer accepted blindly. Hogwarts had reacted. The thigh had responded, and in that quiet, suspended moment, a new pattern was established. The world would wait for him, even in its oldest, most trusted institutions. When he finally opened the letter fully, the words shimmered with magic yet respected the calm, silent dominance that Harry had cultivated for years. Hogwarts had tried to act. The boy had reminded it who would decide. And for the first time in a long while, Harry felt a quiet satisfaction. The same satisfaction he had always taken in unseen victories. The letter had hesitated, but it had not dictated. He would choose the moment to move. He folded the parchment neatly, tucking it under his arm, and rose from the bed. Today, he would walk through the house not as a frightened boy, but as the arbiter of timing, space, and consequence. Hogwarts would have its way, but only when he allowed it. The wards hummed faintly. The letter, quivering slightly, rested in his grip. Harry Potter had learned patience, control, and absolute autonomy, and even the oldest institution in the wizarding world had been minted, quietly but unmistakably, that he was the final authority. The moment Harry stepped through the barrier, the air of Diagon Alley shifted in subtle, imperceptible ways. Not the bustling energy of merchants or the chatter of witches and wizards, but the underlying pulse of attention, the undercurrent that ran beneath polite smiles and idle greetings. Here, everything responded, almost instinctively, to the presence of someone who measured the world in stillness rather than sound. Shops leaned into their shelves as if aware. Bricks adjusted subtly in alignment, and even the cobblestones seemed to hesitate beneath his steps, recognizing the gravity he carried. He walked slowly, deliberately, observing without interacting. Nothing overt, nothing magical, at least not visibly. Yet the reactions were immediate. Shopkeepers straightened, paused mid-sentence, their eyes following him, not with recognition, but with subtle subconscious alignment. A stack of parchment trembled slightly at flourish and blots, edges lifting as though the air itself anticipated him. A clock ticked out of sync for the briefest moment, then resumed, corrected as though acknowledging that time too must wait. Harry's gaze fell first on Ollivander's. The shop had always smelled of polished wood and wax, of dust and the faint hint of magic that lingered in old things. Today, though, the scent tailed sharper, like a warning barely acknowledged. Ollivander himself did not greet him, did not step forward. He stood behind the counter, fingers lightly brushing the surface, eyes narrowing, not in fear, but in calculation. Recognition had flickered there, a subtle acknowledgement of the mark that Harry had long since learned to hide from all others. There was knowledge in that glance, but no commentary, no invitation, no accusation, just the faintest tremor in the aura around the wand shop. Harry approached the counter, noting the objects on display with the precision of a hawk. Wand boxes, loose cores, shafts of wood arranged in meticulous order. They all seemed to acknowledge him in silence. Ollivander's voice, when it came, was soft, measured, careful. "Looking for a wand, Mr. Potter." The words were polite, almost neutral, but Harry felt the subtle tremor beneath them, the ripple in intent that signaled awareness of more than a boy choosing a wand. He studied the shelves, letting his hand hover near a cluster of elder woods, yews and phoenix feathers. A wand shivered faintly at the edge of a box, responding not to touch, not to command, but to attention. It chose him. The selection was aggressive, abrupt, insistent. It did not wait politely for evaluation. It thrust itself forward, aligned to him as though aware of the exact contours of his power, the pattern of his thought, rhythm of his intent, the core, the wood, the weight. It all demanded recognition. Harry flexed his fingers lightly, and the wand pulsed in response, acknowledging alignment, approving restraint, awaiting direction. Ollivander watched without moving, without speaking further. His eyes flicked briefly to Harry's scar, then back to the wand. The implication was clear: knowledge, respect, caution, but no interference. As Harry stepped away, wand in hand, the alley itself seemed to exhale quietly. Shopkeepers returned to their tasks, yet their movements carried a strange, unconscious precision. Shelves settled, goods aligned, coins clicked in trays with measured rhythm. The air had not warmed, but it had acknowledged an authority that no one spoke aloud. Every object, every slight shift of air or shadow had been cataloged, measured, corrected. Harry walked without hurrying, aware of every ripple he caused, noting every subtle reaction. He passed Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, where George and Fred might have shouted or leapt into antics. Today, the shopkeepers froze for the briefest moment, their movements calibrated, attention caught by a presence they could not name. No words, no gesture. Harry's gaze merely passed over them, and they adjusted imperceptibly, aligning their energy to his without comprehension. It was dominance without announcement, power without display, a lesson he had learned under the quiet guidance of the mark that hummed beneath his skin. Everywhere he went, the subtle currents shifted. A broom wobbled slightly at the edge of a cart. A book teetered briefly on a shelf before settling. A coin rolled against its neighbor in rhythm. None of it was visible to anyone else. None of it required words or overt magic. It was observation, intent, and unspoken negotiation with the world. Harry realized something in that silence. The alley itself had become a reflection of control. Fear was unnecessary. Respect was irrelevant. Presence alone, deliberate and disciplined, reshaped reality to his measure. He did not need to announce himself. He did not need to command, to strike, or to demonstrate. The world bent quietly because he existed within it, fully aware, fully measured, fully self-possessed. When he exited, wand secured, scar pulsing faintly beneath his hair, Harry understood that this was no longer just a visit to Diagon Alley. This was a reconnaissance of subtle power, a quiet survey of social currents and magical responsiveness. The alley had not smiled, it had acknowledged, and that acknowledgement had been sufficient. For the first time, he did not feel the need to hide. For the first time, the world did not need to see him as small or frightened, and that realization, more than any spell or charm, solidified his quiet dominion.
Author's note: these chapters explore Harry's quiet mastery, showing how presence and intent shape the world without spectacle. Power is measured, invisible, and unchallenged, proving that dominance need not shout out to be absolute.
The Hogwarts Express rattled along the tracks, steam hissing and churning in rhythmic pulses, but within one particular compartment, a subtle tension had taken hold. Students entered, backpacks swinging, trunks stacked haphazardly, and immediately something felt wrong. It wasn't fear in the usual sense, not panic or terror, but a quiet, almost instinctive unease, as if the air itself had sharpened and they could sense an authority they could not name. Whispers faded, laughter stumbled and died mid-word. A chair that had creaked under the weight of a restless first year went still, as if waiting for permission to move. Harry sat near the window, small and unassuming to any casual glance. His robes hung loosely, his hair untidy, his expression bland, almost disinterested. But beneath the surface, every muscle, every breath, every heartbeat measured the room with precise calculation. He was aware of the currents of attention, the subtle alignments of gaze, the tiny shifts in body posture that betrayed nervousness. The moment someone entered, the balance adjusted, an invisible pressure pushing outward, coaxing movement without a word, without a gesture, without even magic that could be seen. The students noticed it first as a pause, a hesitation in themselves. Conversations stuttered. Pencil cases were set down too gently. Notebooks aligned with unnatural precision. An entire compartment seemed to shrink back, as compelled to give Harry space without understanding why. Even the windows, reflecting the blur of countryside, seemed to darken around him, absorbing light rather than letting it illuminate his figure. It was not overt, not dramatic, yet the effect was immediate. The car emptied gradually, quietly. Friends whispered to each other, tugged sleeves, murmured excuses, and shuffled out, leaving Harry alone with the echo of stillness. A faint tapping announced the approach of another presence. Draco Malfoy, confident and sharp-eyed, leaned into the doorway with a smirk, fully expecting to provoke, to assert the habitual hierarchy. He did not see the subtle alignment of space around Harry, the calm radiance of control that did not demand recognition but simply existed. The smirk faltered almost imperceptibly, though Draco's pride masked it at first. He stepped inside, shoulders squared, wand concealed, and opened his mouth to speak. Harry looked at him without raising an eyebrow, without inflection. There was no fear, no respect, no submission, just a cold, measured acknowledgement of Draco's presence. And in that glance, a silent dismissal sharper than any spell, more precise than any curse. Draco's smirk quivered and retreated under the weight of something unspoken, but undeniable. Harry did not need to act. His intent alone redirected attention, shifted priorities, and rebalanced perception. Words lost their power in the presence of such quiet dominance. Draco's jaw tightened. He wanted to provoke a reaction, a flicker of weakness, some evidence that Harry could be unsettled, as others had been for years. But there was nothing. Harry's eyes were still, his posture relaxed yet deliberate. Every micro-expression, every tiny twitch of a finger or a foot had been accounted for and neutralized before it could manifest. It was a containment of potential energy, so complete that even the air seemed to hesitate around him. Draco's wand hand twitched unconsciously, searching for leverage, but found none. Finally, Harry's voice, soft, even, and carrying an undercurrent of calm authority, broke the silence. "Step aside," he said. The words were minimal, lacking threat, lacking anger, lacking even impatience, yet in the precise calibration of tone and intent, the effect was undeniable. Draco recoiled subtly, instincts guiding him to obey before comprehension could catch up. He muttered an excuse about being late and retreated to the corridor, leaving the compartment entirely vacant except for the faint echo of the encounter. Harry adjusted his sleeve and leaned back slightly, allowing his gaze to wander toward the window, where the landscape passed like a blur of greens and golds. The car was empty, but the space was not silent. It hummed with the tension of presence, an invisible signature of dominance that had shaped the environment without spectacle. He had not moved a finger in aggression, had not raised his wand, and yet every student, every intruder had been filtered, sorted, and neutralized in their perception alone. The lesson was simple, but profound. Power need not be displayed. Threats need not be shouted, and authority required no audience. The compartment, the train, even the world outside, all bent subtly, invisibly to the precision of observation and intent. In this small, mundane setting, Harry had transformed what should have been a typical morning journey into a demonstration of control, so total that it left no witnesses, no trace, and yet an undeniable impression. By the time the train resumed its gentle clatter along the rails, the compartment had returned to its ordinary emptiness, except for one small boy sitting silently by the window, perfectly still, perfectly aware, and utterly untouched by the chaos that usually marked a first-year journey. Harry allowed himself the faintest curve of a smile, unseen by anyone else. Control was not loud, not flashy, not violent. It was complete, and he had exercised it without a single overt gesture. The they and the train would never forget it. The great hall hummed with anticipation, the echo of hundreds of young voices blending into a single, chaotic symphony. First years fidgeted nervously, clutching their robes, shifting from foot to foot, trying to will courage into themselves as the sorting ceremony began. The enchanted ceiling mirrored a perfect night sky, stars twinkling with indifferent brilliance, while candles floated serenely above, casting pools of golden light over nervous faces. For most, this moment was exciting, tinged with nerves and expectation. For Harry Potter, it was an intrusion, a challenge, and a test unlike any he had ever experienced. Though outwardly he appeared calm, expression neutral, hair as unkempt as it had always been, the sorting hat leapt onto his head with a soft thunk, slipping over his hair and sealing him inside its living, whispering folds. Immediately the brim pressed lightly against his brow, and a voice slithered into his mind, probing. A complicated one. Indeed, it mused, warm and analytical, cunning, bravery, loyalty, intelligence. So many threads tangled within. There is power here, though hidden, potential to lead, to dominate, to inspire or destroy. Harry's mind, however, was not the fragile, uncertain vessel the hat expected. Years of silent observation, careful restraint, and precise control had honed him into something sharper than most adults realized. The hat sensed it instantly, feeling the coiled awareness, the patience, the silent calculation, the reservoir of contained force. It tried to probe deeper, to tease out desires and tendencies, but met something unexpected, resistance. Harry did not flinch, did not falter, and his mental voice, calm and precise, pushed back. I am not yours to read. I will not be guided. I will not be commanded. The hat paused, a ripple of surprise spreading through its fibers. Ah, unusual. Most would not resist so calmly. Most would bend, tremble, plead, or struggle, but you are already a master of yourself. And yet, where do your loyalties lie? What path will you choose? Harry allowed the hat to consider him, but did not yield. Instead, he extended a mental warning, subtle but unmistakable. Touch me again, and I will make you regret it. The hat recoiled almost imperceptibly. Its voice, normally silky, coaxing, and persuasive, now carried a note of unease, power, so tightly wound, so deliberate. Your mind is armored. You are dangerous, even to me. Minutes stretched within the hat, though only seconds passed outside. The first years whispered nervously as the sorting hat's delay became obvious. Harry's focus never wavered. He measured the magical currents, the flow of thoughts between hat and self, the probing tendrils of intention seeking to categorize, to command, to manipulate. All of it met calm, deliberate opposition. You could be in Slytherin. Oh yes, the hat tried again, its tone slightly strained. Ambition, cunning, resourcefulness. You would thrive. Great power could be yours, if only you bend. Harry's mental reply was quiet even, but edged with authority. I will not serve ambition for its own sake. I take no loyalty to houses, to ideals, or to arbitrary lines drawn by others. I choose my own path. A flicker of surprise passed through the hat. It had never encountered such a mind, so disciplined, so controlled, so unwilling to submit, even to the ancient wisdom of its own counsel. It tried to argue, to tempt, to twist the possibilities, offering Gryffindor courage, Ravenclaw insight, Hufflepuff loyalty, Slytherin strength. Each offer was weighed, considered, and then mentally declined. Harry did not hesitate, did not panic, did not act rashly. He simply observed, measured, and replied to every subtle nudge with calculated refusal. For a moment, the hat's voice wavered. Most would have accepted by now. Most would have quailed, begged, or at least pretended to choose. But you are unyielding. Exactly, Harry thought. I yield to no one. The magical threads that normally guided first years toward houses frayed around him. The hat could not find a slot, a category, a label that satisfied the depth and precision of Harry's mind. For the first time in centuries, it hesitated in uncertainty, panic threading through its normally confident voice. You resist classification. You defy my guidance. Outside the hat, whispers grew louder. Professor McGonagall's gaze sharpened, her eyebrows raised in surprise, sensing something unusual in the room. Students shifted uncomfortably. Harry remained perfectly still, calm, unbroken. His hand rested lightly on his lap, wand hidden beneath his robe, eyes fixed forward, but seeing everything, aware of everything. The stars, the ceiling, the faces, the currents of magic and expectation swirling through the hall. I will not be sorted into a house by force, Harry's mental voice asserted once more, a steel note threaded through calm detachment. I am mine. No name, no line, no legacy, no hat dictates me. The hat recoiled further, pulling back slightly as if respecting the force of will it had encountered. Remarkable, unprecedented. I do not think I have ever faced such deliberate control, such refusal, such mastery. And then, with a soundless sigh, it made a decision it had never before made. It refused. It did not sort him. It did not claim him. It did not assign. Outside, the sorting siren paused. The hall waited, uneasy and uncertain, as the sorting hat lingered on Harry's head, unable to reach a conclusion, unable to categorize, unable to compel obedience. Minutes, or perhaps longer, passed. Harry's gaze, cool and precise, met the silent ceiling, the enchanted night sky, the trembling currents of magic within the room. I will choose when I choose, he thought. Not you, not them, not anyone. Eventually, the decision was made externally. Hogwarts itself, sensing his unique presence, delayed the announcement. The professors whispered among themselves, aware that something extraordinary had occurred. Though none could name it, the sorting hat, for the first time in its history, admitted that it could not assign Harry Potter to a house. He would remain unplaced until circumstances allowed him to decide for himself or until his will demanded it. For the first time in a century, the sorting hat had met its match, and Harry Potter, small in appearance but immeasurable in control, remained entirely his own master, untethered by expectation, unbound by legacy, unsorted and unafraid. The corridors of Hogwarts whispered with quiet tension as the first whispers of Harry Potter's anomaly spread. Word traveled faster than the enchanted portraits could manage. Students noticed before the teachers did. Harry moved with his usual calm, deliberate pace, wand tucked beneath his robes, eyes assessing, absorbing, noting everything. There was no hurry, no unnecessary gesture, no outward display of power, but his presence radiated something the human mind could not name, a subtle gravity that made heads turn and conversations falter. Even without a house, even without a place to belong in the usual sense, Harry commanded attention. Professors were uneasy. They had been trained to read students, to categorize them, to predict them, and to intervene where necessary. But Harry defied categorization completely. His magical signature was strong yet measured. There were no flare-ups of emotion or reckless displays, no tremors in his control to signal weakness. Yet every calculated movement, every precise word, and every unassuming gesture reminded observers that this child was not ordinary. McGonagall, watching from the staff table, furrowed her brow as she realized that no charm or wisdom had prepared them for this. Harry entered classrooms unassigned, and he respected the routines of Hogwarts. He created a quiet, immutable tension. Teachers found themselves measuring every instruction, considering every interaction, questioning every assumption. Students, on the other hand, felt it immediately. Fear spread like a contagion among them. Not the fear born of threat or violence, but the more insidious kind that arose from knowing someone possessed complete control and refused to reveal it. Friends whispered, enemies avoided, and even the boldest first years gave way, leaving corridors partially empty when Harry walked by. He did not seek to intimidate. There was no magic sparked outward, no threatening words, no gestures of dominance, and yet every student instinctively gave space. instinctively deferred, instinctively understood that they were not in a position to challenge him. The air around him shifted, subtly charged with awareness and precision. In classrooms, he was permitted to sit wherever he wished. Teachers allowed it, hesitant, curious, and unsettled. Harry did not ask for favors, did not announce intentions. He simply chose a seat, observed his surroundings, and engaged when necessary. Questions were answered succinctly, calculations performed silently, and spells executed with flawless technique, never for show, always for precision. The gap between his competence and that of other students became increasingly apparent with each lesson, but the disparity did not provoke jealousy, only cautious respect, edged with fear. Even Draco Malfoy, who had long relied on ridicule and privilege to establish dominance, faltered when he encountered Harry in the corridors. The usual sneer was replaced with a momentary hesitation, a glance that betrayed the instinctive understanding that Harry's control was complete, his patience infinite, his power unspoken yet undeniable. Every subtle move Harry made, from the tilt of his head to the pace of his walk, reinforced the unspoken truth. He was not to be trifled with, and attempts at provocation would meet a cold, precise response. The other students adjusted their behavior unconsciously. Whispers ceased when Harry passed. Wand tips were hidden when he looked their way. Even laughter was muted, carefully measured to avoid drawing attention. Harry did not actively manipulate them with magic. He did not need to, but the combination of his presence, his restraint, and the careful control he exercised over even the smallest gestures ensured compliance without direct action. Fear had proven more efficient than punishment, and he wielded it effortlessly without raising a hand. Teachers conferred quietly in the hallways, attempting to understand this anomaly. Hermione Granger, observant as ever, noted the reactions around her, while Ron Weasley's jaw tightened as he realized that traditional strategies of friendship, rivalry, or influence were ineffective here. Harry's isolation was absolute, but it was a product of his own choice. He accepted the instruction of professors, completed tasks, and followed schedules, but he refused to be owned, assigned, or categorized. This refusal, so subtle yet resolute, made him both untouchable and untouchably frightening. By the end of the first day, the unspoken hierarchy of Hogwarts had shifted. Students no longer approached him carelessly, teachers hesitated to correct him unnecessarily, and the corridors bore the faint impression of his silent authority. He had not raised his voice, he had not drawn his wand, and yet a new order had emerged. Harry Potter was a student without a house, a figure outside the normal structure, and yet entirely within control of every situation that touched him. The silent lessons he had learned under Voldemort's unseen guidance, the patience, the observation, the precise calibration of fear and restraint manifested perfectly. Hogwarts would learn to accommodate him, students would learn to respect him, and even the professors would be forced to acknowledge that this was no ordinary boy. Harry did not smile, did not boast, and did not celebrate. He merely sat, observed, and continued to exist in his own space, utterly untouchable, quietly terrifying, and fully himself.
Author's note: these chapters explore Harry's emergence as a force entirely his own, untethered from houses, expectations, or outside authority. Fear, restraint, and silent mastery replace allegiance, showing that true power is measured in presence, not permission.
From the moment Harry set foot in Hogwarts, the castle itself seemed to react. Corridors that had always bent predictably now shifted subtly around him, staircases reorienting mid-step, doors sliding closed just before he approached, as if the castle were assessing his presence and recalibrating its internal architecture. The portraits whispered in soft, uneasy tones, their painted eyes flicking toward him for a fraction longer than usual, but saying nothing aloud. Every moving staircase, every hallway seemed hesitant, waiting for Harry to decide where he would step, and yet never interfering directly. The ancient wards of Hogwarts, long dormant and assumed passive, hummed faintly in response to the mark on his skin. They did not see a student, they saw a disturbance in the flow of magical intent, a power that was both disciplined and unpredictable, energy that had been steady for centuries pulsed in subtle waves, adjusting around him, protecting him, monitoring him. The castle recognized that he was not ordinary, and it began to shift, not in hostility, not in alignment, but in cautious acknowledgement. Teachers exchanged silent glances, Professor McGonagall paused longer than usual at the entrance to the Great Hall, her brow furrowed as if she could feel the anomaly in the air. Snape's eyes lingered on Harry with an unusual focus, catching the faint pulse of intent beneath the boy's calm exterior. Dumbledore, far away yet connected through the magical network of the school, sensed the same ripples that coursed through the wards. Harry was no longer a child to be managed or guided in the usual ways. He was an unknown variable, one that Hogwarts itself deferred to, adjusting its internal logic to accommodate the anomaly rather than attempting to constrain it. Even the students noticed. Small tremors of unease passed through the corridors when Harry moved, subtle shifts that suggested the castle was bending to him. Rooms that had once been empty suddenly seemed to fill with silent expectation. Classrooms reoriented their magical flow to allow him entry without disturbance. Staircases hesitated mid-turn when he passed, giving him perfect balance and passage. Every magical mechanism, from the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall to the moving suits of armor in the halls, acknowledged him not as a peer, not as a student, but as a singular presence around which reality itself needed to adapt. Harry noticed it, of course. He did not need to exert effort to sense the subtle adjustments. A hallway seemed narrower one day, wider the next, yet always aligned perfectly with his intent to reach a destination. The whispers of the wards under his skin, tiny vibrations in the protective magic cast for him, resonated in quiet approval as he walked. Hogwarts did not challenge him. It did not resist. It merely accommodated, curious and cautious, as if waiting to see what he would do next. The Sorting Hat's absence in his life became clearer in this context. Hogwarts did not attempt to classify him, to channel him into houses or traditions. Instead, it deferred. The portraits ceased their usual chatter. The staircases no longer made sudden, disruptive movements. The enchanted windows aligned to frame his passage. The castle treated him as an anomaly, a presence outside expectation, and it reshaped itself around him with silent precision. And Harry, as always, remained calm. He did not marvel, nor did he attempt to bend the castle to his will. He walked through corridors that shifted subtly under his observation, eyes calm, hands relaxed, measuring the flow of energy rather than imposing it. The wards, the hallways, the very architecture of Hogwarts acknowledged him silently, and Harry catalogued it all. Every hesitation, every subtle adjustment, every flicker of magical awareness the castle exhibited. He was not a student here. He was not even a guest. He was an unacknowledged force of nature, and Hogwarts, ancient and vast, had learned to respect that force before even its first lesson began. By the time Harry reached the central atrium, he paused briefly, observing the faint shimmer of the wards, the slight hesitation of moving staircases, the flicker of portraits' eyes. Everything was in place. Everything moved around him, yet nothing interfered. The castle had accepted him, not as part of its system, but as a singular entity whose presence demanded adjustment, and in that quiet recognition, Harry understood something fundamental. Hogwarts was no longer a school in the ordinary sense. It was a living, breathing entity that had adapted to him, and in that adaptation lay both opportunity and danger. The boy who had mastered restraint, observation, and control outside the castle now walked through a school that had begun to treat him as a reality beyond rules, beyond tradition, and beyond expectation, and Harry, as always, noted, observed, and waited. The wards pulsed faintly under his skin. Hogwarts shifted around him, and the castle, vast and ancient, began to learn that some presences could not be contained. Harry was one of them. The Sorting Hat regarded Harry longer than it had any other student in living memory. Its voice, a low whisper in his mind, probed, tested, and recoiled in measured hesitation. It sensed the precision of thought, the calm mastery of intent, the patience honed over years in the shadowed household of Privet Drive. This was not a mind shaped by ordinary upbringing or magical instruction. It was a mind disciplined beyond its apparent age, aware of power yet restrained, calculating yet silent. For the first time, the Hat realized it could not categorize him in the usual terms of loyalty, bravery, cunning, or intellect. "I see what you are," it murmured, voice threading like smoke. "I see potential that exceeds even the bounds of any house I know. You are disciplined, calculating, patient beyond reason, and yet you are a force contained only by your own design." Harry remained still, allowing the Hat to observe, to assess. He did not intervene. He did not attempt to charm or threaten. He waited, as always, for the moment when restraint could assert authority without demonstration. The Hat considered Gryffindor, sensing courage, but courage here was tactical, not reckless. Ravenclaw for intellect. Intellect was present, but tied to control and precision rather than curiosity or whim. Hufflepuff's loyalty was irrelevant. Loyalty existed only to strategy and self-preservation. Then the Hat's probing reached Slytherin, and it paused. Here, it sensed containment rather than choice, obligation rather than affinity. Here, it felt a house forced to accept a problem rather than a student's desire to belong. "I can place you in Gryffindor," the Hat murmured, "or Ravenclaw, or even Hufflepuff, but none of it aligns with the discipline you have cultivated. Only one house will contain you without destruction." Harry's thought was simple, calm, and precise. Containment, not preference. The Hat recoiled briefly, sensing no defiance, no fear, no pleading. It recognized the inevitability. Slytherin would be the cage the boy allowed, not a home, not a choice, not a reward, but a measured containment, and in that, the Hat sensed the truth. Harry would bend the house to his observation, not the house bending him. "Very well," the Hat whispered finally. "Slytherin." Then, not for pride, not for ambition, but because it is the only boundary you allow. Contain yourself and learn control. As the words settled in his mind, Harry felt the subtle pulse of magical acknowledgement from the house itself. Slytherin House, ancient and cunning, sensed the arrival of a student it could not easily predict or control. Its members felt the subtle shift in air, the quiet weight of expectation, the unseen pressure of a boy who commanded attention without raising his voice. There was no pride. There was no celebration. There was only the acknowledgement that the problem had arrived, and that it would not behave as anticipated. The other first years watched silently as the Sorting Hat's decision was announced, sensing the change in tone, the subtle unease in the air. Few realized what had just occurred. To them, Harry Potter was Wireless Slytherin now, no different from any other. But the house itself, steeped in centuries of cunning and hierarchy, had recognized that it had inherited an anomaly, one who would follow rules only when it suited his purpose, who would respect power only when it could be measured, and who would influence events quietly, invisibly, without need of acknowledgement. In the common room, the shadows seemed heavier, the air thicker. Slytherin House could feel it. Harry was not a student to be molded or mentored. He was a presence to accommodate. His influence was silent but pervasive. Every glance, every step, every measured breath carried weight that the others instinctively sensed. Containment, not pride, defined his place here, and in that containment, Harry found no discomfort. He was already accustomed to the world bending subtly to his perception without interference, and Slytherin House, ancient and calculating, would now play its part. He seated himself at the table, eyes calm, posture relaxed, as if no decision had been made. The whispers of the house wards pulsed faintly in acknowledgement, adjusting to the subtle rules he now imposed, simply I-existing. Harry did not boast. He did not assert dominance overtly. He simply existed, and in that existence, Slytherin recalibrated itself to accommodate a force it had never anticipated. Outside, the castle continued to hum, aware of the presence of a boy who defied ordinary measurement, whose magic and awareness exceeded expectation, whose control was as precise as any spell he had learned. Hogwarts itself seemed to lean closer to observe, not to restrain, recognizing that the anomaly had arrived and that the Sorting Hat had done no more than formalize what was already undeniable. Harry Potter, seated among Slytherins, felt no need for approval, no need for recognition. He had been contained, not honored. The house accepted the problem, and for Harry, that was all he needed. The dueling platform in the Great Hall was unusually quiet that morning. Word had spread quickly. Harry Potter was to face a seventh-year challenger, one who prided himself on skill, speed, and reputation. The students gathered along the edges, their eyes alight with anticipation, whispers threading through the air like sparks in a dry forest. Everyone expected a spectacle. They expected fire incantations, the dramatic exchange of curses and hexes, and yet the air around Harry was calm, measured, and unyielding. His opponent, a tall, lean boy from Slytherin with a reputation for dueling prowess, stepped forward with confidence, wand raised, lips curling in a smug grin. The boy's every movement was designed to intimidate, a flourish here, a sudden stomp there, a show of control that had won him many smaller duels. Yet even before a word was spoken, Harry's presence seemed to ripple through the platform. The subtle aura of controlled focus, honed over years of invisible observation, reached the edges of the hall. The other students, the staff, and even the duelists felt it, an almost imperceptible weight, as if the air itself demanded restraint and attention. "Ready?" the seventh year said, voice sharp, attempting authority. Harry simply nodded, his eyes calm, focused. There was no tremor of fear, no sign of hesitation, no twitch in his posture. Every muscle in his body exuded restraint, a silent assurance that any "and" would be precise, deliberate, and final if necessary. The duel began. A flick of a wrist, a practiced incantation, a wand raised. The opponent shouted a hex intended to unseat Harry immediately, a fast, aggressive curse that would have toppled most as in moments. But Harry moved almost imperceptibly, more a shift of intent than motion, the faintest adjustment of balance and focus. The curse never reached him fully. It stalled mid-air, flickering in an unseen barrier of pure awareness. Time seemed to slow. The other students froze, sensing that something extraordinary was occurring, though they could not define it. The seventh year's brow furrowed. His confidence faltered. The hex he had relied on for quick victories hung useless in the air, powerless against the quiet precision of Harry's focus. Harry's response was not a spell, but a thought, a subtle, cold intention projected with clarity. He did not raise his wand. He did not shout an incantation. He simply let the presence of his awareness extend to the opponent, calibrating every microsecond of space and reaction. The other boy's muscles locked for the briefest moment. His confidence unraveled silently. No sound betrayed it. No motion was forced. And yet, in that instant, the message was clear. Any further aggression would be a mistake, one he could not recover from. "Enough," Harry said softly, his voice carrying easily across the platform, despite the lack of raised volume. Calm, cold, and precise, it resonated with authority that had nothing to do with volume or spectacle. The seventh year stumbled backward, chest tight, breath caught, fully aware he had faced more than magic. He had faced absolute control, his wand hand lowered instinctively, trembling. The duel was over before it had truly begun. No injuries, no shouting, no spectacle, only the undeniable awareness that Harry Potter had the power to end any conflict silently, instantly, and without a trace of emotion. The students remained frozen, whispers halted mid-phrase. A few older students, known for their dueling experience, exchanged glances of disbelief. Teachers raised eyebrows, subtly, sensing that something unnatural had occurred, yet finding no fault, no chaos, no rule broken. Even Dumbledore, observing from the staff table, narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. Harry had not broken any rules, had not even fired a wand, and yet the authority he radiated demanded acknowledgement, compliance, and respect without coercion. The defeated duelist, pale and unsettled, looked at Harry with a mixture of fear and reluctant awe. He did not speak, did not accuse, did not attempt retaliation. He simply understood the message Harry had sent, perfectly and completely. Aggression against him would not be tolerated, and force, while unnecessary, would be absolute if invoked. Harry lowered his eyes, glanced briefly at the other students, and returned to a neutral posture. No one dared approach him. No one dared mock him. And yet no one could claim he had acted unfairly. The duel had ended in seconds, but the lesson had stretched through the hall like an invisible wave. Harry Potter was not a child to be challenged lightly. Authority, patience, and precise control outweighed wand work, speed, or brute magical power. In that moment, the balance of perception shifted. Students realized that magic was not only in the words of a spell, the flick of a wand, or the dramatic gestures of a duel. It was in mastery of self, in timing, in calm awareness that could paralyze intent without a whisper or a curse. Harry had demonstrated it perfectly. By the end of the morning, the tale of the duel spread quietly among the students, not as gossip of violence, but as acknowledgement of something far greater. Harry Potter was no longer a student to be underestimated. The duel had required no lethal intent, no showy magic, no fear beyond comprehension, and yet the message was unmistakable. Even the most confident opponents would reconsider before testing him again. The seventh year retreated to the edge of the hall, wand lowered, posture defensive, Every subsequent challenger approached him with hesitation, reading the silence, the precision, the unspoken authority that Harry radiated. The duel had ended early, but its effect rippled outward, touching every student who had witnessed it, reshaping the hierarchy of perception within Hogwarts, without a single destructive spell being cast. Harry returned to his place among the other students, calm, composed, and entirely unaffected by the demonstration. He did not boast, did not gloat, did not acknowledge the fear that lingered in the air. The lesson was complete. The message delivered: authority without action, control without exposure, and silence without hesitation. This was the new standard. The first duel had ended early, but the consequences would last far longer than any spell or hex ever could.
Author's note: the duels, the sorting, and the castle's shifting halls reveal a Harry who commands presence, not spectacle. Power is quiet, deliberate, and undeniable, fearless, yet controlled, shaping Hogwarts without breaking it.
The morning sun filtered through the high windows of the Hogwarts staff room, catching the dust motes in slow spirals. Professor McGonagall stood near her desk, robes folded sharply, expression taut with expectation. She had spent the night reviewing reports and rumors, each whisper more alarming than the last. There was a sense of unease among the faculty. Whispers of Harry Potter's presence, unbound by house, untested by authority, had spread quickly. Even the portraits muttered caution. Today, she would attempt to assert control. She would test the boy. The test was simple, at least in theory: a controlled display of authority, a charm, a simple restriction, a demonstration of the boundaries that governed every other student. McGonagall's wand arced in a practiced motion, words precise, intention clear. She expected compliance. She expected caution. She expected fear. Harry Potter sat quietly, robes tidy but posture relaxed. His eyes met hers without flicker of doubt or deference. There was no trembling, no flinch, no trace of the fragile child she remembered reading about in letters. The boy waited, still as marble, observing. When the spell reached him, attempting to enforce movement against his will, it faltered almost immediately, stuttering in midair. The force that should have been unstoppable slowed, hesitated, and then held because Harry willed it, held because he allowed the magic to exist, but refused the direction. McGonagall's brow furrowed. She attempted another charm, slightly stronger, nuanced, designed to probe his reflexes. Again, nothing. The room seemed to pulse subtly with Harry's awareness, the faint rhythm of his control threading through the spellwork without effort. "You are trained," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Not gifted, trained." Professor Snape, standing just behind, observed quietly. His lips curled into a thin line, a mixture of approval and intrigue. Years of magical theory, of dueling experience, of magical pedagogy, all converged in this observation. The boy was a student of discipline, of control, of anticipation. He did not act impulsively, nor did he rely on luck or innate talent. He anticipated, neutralized, and contained. The distinction was subtle, but profound. McGonagall's voice broke the silence. "Limits, Mr. Potter. Everyone has limits. You will respect them." Harry inclined his head once, minimally, almost politely, but there was no fear, no submission. He allowed the acknowledgement of the instruction, but the energy in the room shifted. The command, the boundary she shipped to impose, was no longer hers to enforce. It existed, technically, theoretically, but not practically. Harry's presence recalibrated it, reshaped it, and left it inert. Snape stepped forward, wand idle at his side. "Impressive," he said, voice low and deliberate. "You are aware, not reckless, not naive." Most students would have failed immediately. Harry's expression did not change. He did not smile, did not gloat. The acknowledgement was unnecessary. The lesson he had internalized over years of shadowed training was clear. Power was not announced, and compliance was never earned through fear alone. It was observed, cataloged, and anticipated. The staff exchanged glances. McGonagall, despite her formidable reputation, felt the familiar creeping unease of realizing that traditional authority held no weight here. Every lecture, every charm, every carefully honed teaching technique obsolete in the face of Harry Potter's quiet mastery. Snape, in contrast, leaned slightly forward, intrigued rather than concerned. Here was a student who had not simply survived the Dark Lord's tutelage. He had absorbed, he had refined, he had emerged as a measured, deliberate force. "Do you understand why your boundaries exist, Mr. Potter?" McGonagall asked, her voice firmer now. Harry's response was precise, calm, and entirely unsentimental. "I understand them. I respect them insofar as I allow them to exist. But I will not be constrained where there is no threat. I will not be tested unnecessarily." McGonagall froze. The audacity was correct, rational, yet defiant. It was a defiance not born of emotion, of rage, of disrespect, but of calculation, observation, and quiet power. Harry did not speak to challenge. He spoke to assert clarity. Snape's lips quirked. "Good," he muttered. "You passed today's test, not by yielding, but by existing as you are." The room settled into a tense silence. The professors had set boundaries, and the boy had redefined them. Every movement, every word, every spell that might have carried authority was measured against him, and he adjusted at unit effort, without flourish. Hogwarts, for the first time in its long history, recognized that one student could exist outside conventional structures, and the ripple of uncertainty spread quietly among the staff. McGonagall exhaled softly, lowering her wand. She would try again. She would attempt control in other ways. But she knew, as did Snape, that Harry's education, his discipline, and his restraint had already placed him beyond most conventional measures. This was not arrogance. This was preparedness. This was inevitability. And Harry Potter, calm, composed, and still seated in the staff room, understood the lesson entirely. The professors could set boundaries. He could choose which to respect, and in doing so, he would continue to define the terms of his presence in a school that had long expected him to be ordinary. The day ended quietly. No spells were cast, no curses attempted. The staff left with unease, and Harry remained, silent, unshaken, already cataloging their reactions for future reference. Hogwarts had tested him, and learned, subtly and reluctantly, that Harry Potter was no longer a student to be managed. Wandless, expression, neutral, presence, measured, he allowed the room itself to adjust around him. Every charm, every precaution, every subtle enchantment responded to the quiet calibration of his awareness. The boundaries were still there, but no longer for him. Harry Potter had set the new rules, and Hogwarts, ancient and ever watchful, would have to adapt. The classroom at Hogwarts was quiet, quieter than it had any right to be. Desks sat in neat rows, quills poised above parchment, and a dozen students stared at Harry Potter with varying degrees of fascination and he. Professor Flitwick fluttered nervously near the front, wand in hand, eyes darting between the boy and the class. The day had begun like any other, with carefully structured lessons in charms, but within minutes, the room had changed. Harry Potter, seated near the center, did not raise his hand, did not fidget, and did not respond to the teacher's initial calls for participation. Yet he was speaking, quietly, calmly, and without prompting. His answers did not address questions asked aloud. They anticipated concerns, corrected misconceptions, and elaborated upon principles students had not even considered. Flitwick's voice faltered. Harry, are you addressing the syllabus?" Harry's tone was precise, neutral, and entirely devoid of arrogance. "I am addressing the principle behind the enchantment, Professor. The application will follow once the understanding is complete." The words were simple, but the effect was profound. Every student froze. Hermione's pencil hovered mid-scribble. Ron's jaw slackened. Even the Slytherins, normally eager to insert sharp commentary, remained silent. It was not intimidation in the conventional sense. There were no curses, no threats, no overt displays of power. Yet the room had collectively paused, as if it had recognized a force too precise to interrupt. The faint pulse of control emanated from Harry, subtle and nearly imperceptible, yet undeniable. Flitwick tried again. "Yes, but how does that apply in practice?" Before he could finish, Harry interjected, calm and even. "The application is contingent on correct channeling. Misalignment results in energy dissipation, reducing effectivity. It is preferable to understand fully before execution." The class remained motionless. Every eye followed him, every ear tuned to each syllable. It was as if Harry's presence had created a vacuum where ordinary curiosity, distraction, and classroom chatter could not exist. The silence was complete. Absolute, not enforced by authority, but by recognition. This boy was operating on a level they did not yet comprehend. Flitwick's fingers trembled slightly on his wand. He cleared his throat. Very well, we will. Move on. His voice lacked its usual enthusiasm, replaced with uncertainty. He no longer called on Harry. The teacher had realized that attempts to direct the boy were redundant. Harry had chosen what to say, when to say it, and how to present it. The lesson was no longer his to control. The students, though intimidated, absorbed every word, every subtle inflection, and learned more from what was unsaid than from the formal instruction. By the end of the hour, the classroom had become a chamber of observation. Every student took notes, careful not to draw Harry's attention unnecessarily. Every quill moved with deliberation. Even the energetic third years, normally prone to chatter, remained muted, unsure how to navigate the space alongside someone so profoundly aware, so quietly dominant. Harry himself remained still, expression neutral, hands folded neatly atop his desk. There was no display of superiority, no smirk, no indication that he had claimed the room. Yet he had. The silence persisted because it is chosen, not demanded. His control was absolute, silent, and efficient. The teacher had stopped calling on him not out of neglect, but because he recognized the futility of interruption. As the bell finally rang, releasing the students from their desks, the shift lingered. The class filed out in near-perfect order. Whispers hushed, eyes still lingering on Harry as they exited. Flitwick exhaled, fingers trembling, wand clutched too tightly in his grip. He had witnessed a phenomenon that could not be ignored, that could not be measured by normal standards. Harry Potter had spoken without being spoken to, controlled without imposing, and taught without formal instruction. And as the last student left, Harry remained seated, silent, composed, a figure of calm dominance. The class that had begun with lively chatter had ended in stillness, observation, and acknowledgement. The boy was ordinary student. No one called on him again. No one dared. Harry Potter had silently rewritten the rules of participation. The teacher had learned restraint. The students had learned awareness. And Harry, quiet, patient, and unshakable, had claimed authority without a word of defiance, a motion of wand, or a flicker expression. Deep beneath the polished floors of Hogwarts, in passages long forgotten, even by the oldest portraits, a presence stirred. The corridors themselves seemed to shiver as if anticipating recognition. Ancient magic, older than the school's founding stones, roused at last from dormancy. It was a creature both guardian and sentinel, woven from threads of protective spells and instinctive intelligence, inhabiting the very foundation of the castle. No ordinary student could perceive it, yet Harry Potter did, not with sight, not with sound, but with awareness. He felt the pulse of the old magic, the subtle rhythm beneath the stone and mortar, like a heartbeat that had been waiting for him. Harry moved with deliberate steps across the corridor, leading to the underlevels, his senses alert, his presence calm. The creature stirred more noticeably now, a ripple of energy in the air. It did not approach in aggression, nor did it retreat in fear. Instead, it acknowledged him, as if recognizing a kindred will, someone who could perceive its language, its intent, and its purpose. The connection was silent, instinctual, and complete. The creature responded to Harry's thoughts before they fully formed, shifting shadows and currents of energy around him in subtle alignment. Meanwhile, Dumbledore, far above in his office, paused in his meticulous work, his eyes, half-lidded behind the crescent of his spectacles, narrowed slightly. Reports from enchanted wards, whispers from protective charms, subtle vibrations from magical conduits, all spoke a single, undeniable truth. Harry Potter did not simply belong to Hogwarts. He belonged to something older, something vast, something that predated both founders and modern spellcraft. The castle itself acknowledged it, bending its secrets quietly to the boy's presence. Harry crouched in the shadows of the ancient corridor, fingertips lightly brushing the cold stone. He felt the currents of power flowing beneath him, wrapping around his awareness. The creature, sensing the boy's intent, was zened with a delicate undulation of force. The air vibrated softly, particles shifting, subtle energies aligning. Harry's connection to the Guardian was not one of dominance. It was mutual recognition. The creature understood him as protector. He understood it as ally. No words were necessary, only perception and focus. From the shadows above, The castle seemed to hold its breath. Statues, tapestries, and enchanted suits of armor remained motionless, as though waiting for a signal they would never receive. The creature moved closer, still unseen to mortal eyes, aligning itself along Harry's path. Every step he took, every shift of thought, caused a ripple of motion within the ancient guardian's presence. Hogwarts itself had no mechanism to oppose him. The wards that protected against intruders registered nothing amiss. To the school, Harry was simply a student moving through empty corridors. Yet underneath, in the veins of stone and magic, a profound awareness was awakening. Dumbledore's gaze, far removed yet surprisingly precise, detected the subtle alterations in magical resonance. He frowned, realizing the implications. Hogwarts had taught and restrained many prodigies, but this was different. Harry Potter was not only perceiving the castle's defenses, he was negotiating with them, communicating with a consciousness older than the school itself. He belonged not to the walls or to the charms, but to the living memory of the castle's hidden power, a force Dumbledore had long suspected existed, but never encountered directly. Harry paused, letting the creature study him in turn. His eyes, calm and deliberate, reflected no fear, only acknowledgement. The Guardian, sensing a mind capable of understanding intent without misjudgment, relaxed its tension, though it remained vigilant. Their exchange was instantaneous, silent, and profound. The boy had not raised a wand. No spell had been cast. The creature had reacted purely to his presence, his clarity of thought, and the precision of his awareness. Dumbledore murmured under his breath, his voice tinged with awe and concern. So it begins, and so the boy truly belongs to older magic. Harry continued walking, the currents of the Guardian weaving around him in subtle agreement, reshaping shadows, adjusting energies, and quietly acknowledging him as a participant in the ancient hierarchy of Hogwarts. The castle, alive and aware in ways that defied all modern definitions of magic, had silently passed judgment. Harry Potter was recognized, not as a student, not as a child, but as someone aligned with the primal and timeless force that underlay the school itself. As he reached the end of the corridor, Harry felt the Guardian settle into a watchful stillness, neither following nor leaving, merely observing in readiness. The pulse of its presence continued to resonate faintly beneath the stone, a quiet reassurance that some part of Hogwarts' oldest and most secret magic was no longer isolated, no longer dormant. And in that instant, Harry understood the depth of his own reach. The castle would bend, shift, and respond to his awareness, not because he demanded it, but because the recognition had been granted, and the Virion had chosen to acknowledge him. Hogwarts was no longer merely a school. It was a living entity, sensing, weighing, and preparing for a student who was no ordinary boy. Harry Potter was now part of something far larger, older, and infinitely more complex than anyone, including Dumbledore, had ever anticipated. From the moment Harry entered Hogwarts, the usual rhythms of friendship, alliances, and camaraderie shifted subtly around him. Hermione Granger, ever perceptive and driven by curiosity, observed the boy with an intensity that few could maintain. Her eyes, usually bright with the excitement of knowledge and connection, narrowed slightly as she catalogued every movement, every glance, every micro-expression Harry displayed. She did not approach him with the eagerness of a potential friend. She did not attempt casual conversation or shared study sessions. Instead, she positioned herself at a careful distance, watching. Every interaction, every choice Harry made was measured, precise, deliberate, and utterly unlike any student she had ever encountered. Hermione quickly recognized that Harry's presence demanded respect, not affection. The small gestures he allowed in public, the faintest indications of power and awareness, were not signals to be reciprocated. They were words, or perhaps statements of autonomy. She saw the subtle manipulation of perception in his every motion, the tilt of his head, the way he allowed others to underestimate him, the deliberate cadence of his voice when spoken to. Hermione realized she could approach him as a friend, or she could learn from him. But one path carried risk, the other potential understanding. She chose understanding. In class, Hermione maintained a precise awareness of Harry's position. She did not volunteer answers in the same way around him. She did not compete for his attention. Instead, she observed quietly, comparing his method of engagement with the textbooks, with theoretical magic, and with the reactions of professors and other students. She noticed how teachers, even the most experienced, subtly deferred to his presence or unconsciously moderated their lessons. She saw how students instinctively created space, adjusting their behavior in accordance with an unspoken hierarchy that Harry alone seemed to define. It was not fear that kept Hermione distant, it was comprehension. She understood that to approach Harry as a typical friend might disrupt a careful equilibrium he had spent years cultivating. She would not risk undermining the patterns he had honed through observation, restraint, and control. She studied him, cataloged his tactics and choices, and considered potential strategies of interaction, all with the precision of a researcher analyzing a rare and intelligent species. Harry noticed Hermione's approach, or lack thereof. He understood instinctively why she kept her distance. There was a faint tension, a quiet respect, and a cautious observation in her gaze. Unlike other students, she did not fumble with idle chatter or attempt forced familiarity. Harry did not test her, did not invite her, but acknowledged her presence with a slight nod or brief glance that carried measured recognition. There was no warmth, no personal invitation, only acknowledgement that she existed in a space he allowed. Their interactions, when they occurred, were functional, minimal, and precise. Questions in class were answered without extra words. Debates were conducted logically, without veiled emotion or competition. Hermione recorded, absorbed, and analyzed. Harry, in turn, offered nothing more than necessity. No kindness, no camaraderie, no visible effort at connection. Only engagement that fit the situation and reinforced the order he had established for himself. Over time, a tacit understanding formed, mutual respect without friendship. Hermione would not interfere. Harry would not impose. She would observe without attachment. He would allow without indulgence. And in that space, each learned from the other. Hermione about the limits of human perception and control. Harry about the precision of intellect and observation applied without emotional bias. The distance between them was deliberate, protective, and revealing. It demonstrated that not all connections need warmth or familiarity to be meaningful. Some relationships, forged in caution and comprehension, could offer insight more powerful than friendship itself. Hermione, while never a friend in the traditional sense, became one of the few witnesses to Harry's evolving mastery, a silent observer of his growth, strategy, and unspoken rules. By the end of the first term, Hermione had chosen her path. She would study Harry. She would catalog him, learn from him, and consider the implications of his presence within Hogwarts. But she would not attempt friendship. That line was crossed by no one, not even Hermione Granger, whose mind and curiosity were unmatched. Harry, aware of her choice, neither pursued nor discouraged it. He accepted it as one would a variable in an experiment, useful, observable, but ultimately secondary to the broader patterns he controlled. They existed in the Thayer space, but each moved according to separate rules. Respect existed, friendship did not, and both understood why. In the quiet moments between classes, between lessons, between wards and whispers, Hermione continued her study, and Harry continued his silent assertion of presence, untouched, unchallenged, and fully observed. The distance was worth it, necessary, and complete.
Note: these chapters explore the delicate balance of observation, control, and autonomy, showing how Harry shapes his world without reliance on friendship or fear. They highlight that respect can exist without closeness, and power often manifests in subtle restraint rather than overt action. This chapter closes, but the darkness is never gone. Join us again on Crimson Tales.